First, we need to find out about what's going on in the province. And we are going to find that out from our fabulous Minister of Education, for whom I have no bio. But she's been the Minister of Education for quite a while now, and before that she knew a lot about school boards. She knows a lot about the education system in Ontario. I think you have been a teacher. Have you been a teacher? At university, there you go. And she has been our Minister of Education for a long time, and People for Education thinks of itself as a critical friend of the government. We do a lot of work with the government, and I am very, very, very pleased that Minister Liz Sandals is here to talk to you about education in Ontario today. Thank you.
See, it turns out that if you've been a trustee for 15 years, everybody figures you were actually a teacher, which isn't true. But that's why she thinks I was a teacher. It was because I was a trustee for 15 years. Anyway, thank you, Annie. It's great to be back here again. And I want to thank all of you for your commitment to public education in Ontario, because obviously you wouldn't be here if you weren't committed to public education in Ontario. So thank you for being here and participating in what I'm hearing has been a wonderful day. All sorts of fascinating speakers and great panels. So it sounds like you've all had a wonderful time. And I don't want to take too long because Annie really wants a beer. But I thought I'd start with a bit of what, sort of evolving good news. As I'm sure you know, after months of bargaining, we've now reached central agreements with all 4 of our teacher federations, and also with CUPE. CUPE is now the first of the support worker, education worker contracts, and the first one where we've had all 4 trustee associations at the table, because CUPE works in all 4 sectors, so that means they have 4 different associations as their employer bargaining agent. So that's been a first too. So we've got 5 down, 4 to go. So what we've got left, so let me talk about CUPE a little bit. CUPE represents caretaking and maintenance in almost all the boards in all 4 sectors. They also represent the other education workers, people like secretary clerical and EAs and ECEs and professional student supports in some boards. OSSTF actually represents education workers in many boards, not caretaking and maintenance, but all the other. So in the board where I was a trustee, I think there were actually like 3 or 4 different locals of OSSTF education workers. So that one we still have to do. And then there's 3 others where there's less than 20 locals in each group. One is the ETFO education workers, because there's a few boards where particularly ECEs are represented by ETFO. And then there's 2 other groups which are coalitions or alliances of a whole bunch of locals. None of the people that are involved in the local represent more than 4 locals. So there's something called the Ontario Coalition of Education Workers, and then there's the Education Workers Alliance of Ontario. And if you can't keep it sorted out, don't feel bad. I have to keep asking for the list of who all's in that coalition. So anyway, that's what we've still got to do. But with CUPE as our first education workers contract arrived at, that's actually quite good news, because that's the biggest group. And hopefully we can now move on with the other. So This has obviously been quite difficult and taken quite a long time. The first time through has been unique because it's the first time that we've ever had to figure out what are the central issues and what are the local issues. And that in itself was a 6-month discussion with multiple referrals to the Ontario Labour Relations Board whenever there was a disagreement. We will never have to do that again. And then there has been the negotiations with each of the tables. And I'm not sure whether people really clearly understand that even though we've had provincial framework tables before, there's actually never ever been central agreements before. This is a first that we're actually essentially bargaining 9 first collective agreements. And if anything of you know anything about labor relations, the first collective agreement is always quite extended, quite difficult, because you have to take and figure out each and every clause in the collective agreement. When you go to bargain subsequent agreements, most of it you just say, yeah, that's status quo, and move on to the next clause. So the point of all this is, yes, it has been long, yes, it has been arduous, but we can only do the first time once. So we will never have to do all the stuff that we've been doing this time ever again. Once we get those 9 first agreements, we never ever have to do it again. So I am looking forward with great delight that I'm going to be able to go back to being the Minister of Education instead of the Minister of Collective Bargaining, and we can actually talk about education. So I am now going to ignore collective bargaining and talk to you about education and let you know that there actually really are some really exciting things going on in education in Ontario. So, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for our partnership with People for Education. You've really been over many, many years now, wonderful partners, and I'd like to thank you for all the work that you do to support public education, and quite frankly, to be advocates for public education, because there are times when you actually don't feel like everybody is being an advocate for public education, and it's always nice to know that there are some folks there that you can count on to fight for public education. The good news is that in Ontario, we're actually graduating more and more and more students. In fact, if you look at 2003, the high school graduation rate in Ontario was 68%. It's now 84%. That's a huge increase in the proportion of students who are actually completing high school and moving on to the workplace or to post-secondary education, but they've got that high school education successfully under their belt. That's a significant change. One of the most significant challenges that we face now, though, is how do we best prepare our students for a new technology-driven world? As I expect many of you know, a year or so ago, our government launched Achieving Excellence, a renewed for education in Ontario. And the renewed vision builds on the solid foundation that already exists here in Ontario and reaches farther. And People for Education and thousands of other stakeholders all across the province were part of developing that new vision. And it doesn't just reflect stakeholder insiders, it also represents the vision of all sorts of other people, business, not-for-profits, community, post-secondary educators, and always students. At every single table where there was a round table discussion, there was a student. At every single table, at every single consultation, because it was very important that we kept that grounding of hearing from students. So we've got a new vision. We have, as I said, been a little bit distracted, but we've actually made some progress, and I want to share that with you. So to help us achieve excellence, we continue to keep a focus on math supports for teachers and students, because we know that we need to continue to deal with the ongoing issue of math and making sure students have a good grounding in math. Certainly this involves a comprehensive approach to math teaching, so that we're providing instruction in math concepts, in skills, and also in problem solving, so that students actually know how to use math and how to apply it. So far, we've supported more than 6,000 teachers in additional math training. And we've also clearly heard from students that it's important to them, in addition not just to math, but moving on, for them to have access in innovative technology-based teaching and learning opportunities. So we've actually been investing $150 million in schools over the last 3 years for technology and learning tools, such as new digital tablets, netbooks, cameras, software, and professional development around how to effectively use technology. Because it's not just enough to have technology in the school. The really big issue is actually, how do you effectively use the technology so that it's not just a substitute for pen and paper, so that it's actually enhancing and expanding learning, not just there. We need to, and I think that's part of the ongoing struggle, or at least discussion, is how do we really use the new technology effectively so that it's value added and not just a substitution. We've also implemented the Child Care and Early Years Act, which was proclaimed August 31st, a few months ago, to create a more responsive, high-quality and accessible child care and early years system. And again, just to give you a little bit of data there, we've actually increased the number of licensed child care spaces in Ontario by 10% in the last year. We've increased the number of licensed child care spaces in Ontario by 87% since 2003. And I think that tends to often run against people's perception that we've had that much of a change, that much of an increase. And certainly there's more work to do, and that's why we brought in the new act. But I don't think people understand how significant a change there has actually been in the child care end of things. If we turn to the ensuring equity pillar in our vision, we've continued to make some strides there. We continue to focus on increasing graduation rates and closing achievement gaps for Aboriginal students, for teens and young single parents, for students that are in the care of Children's Aid Society, because almost by definition, if you are in the care of the Children's Aid Society, you have by definition faced tremendous struggles and had tremendous crises in your little young life to be in the care of Children's Aid, and it has almost inevitably have had a serious negative impact on your education. So that we know that we need to work more closely with our Children's Aid Society to make sure that as they intervene to stop whatever abuse is occurring, that we're intervening as well as an education system to try and support that young child or that teen in trying to pick up some of the pieces in their educational life as well. So there's a lot of work going on in that area, with boards and Children's Aid working more closely than they traditionally have. One of the obstacles there is that traditionally, I think with many of the Children's Aid Society, that they've been reluctant to share information because of privacy issues and stigma. And of course, if you're a teacher and you don't know the background of what's happened to this child. How can you really support the child? So it's working through some of these conflicts and figuring out how as educators we can really provide those supports. We're doing a lot of pilot programs to see what works, what doesn't work in these sorts of areas. And we've also just finished recently a consultation on our adult education strategy, because we know that in today's world there's a lot of adults who need to reach back and pick up their high school graduation if they're going to move ahead. So we're looking at renewing our adult education strategy as well. And that strategy will promote partnerships among school boards to increase in access to a variety of flexible and responsive programs and services to accommodate the diverse needs of adult learners. And certainly one of the things that we find is that when you get outside the urban areas, that it's often very challenging for the boards to develop that adult ed capacity. So we're looking at how do we bring clusters of boards together to really create regional adult ed networks so we can do a better job of supporting people there. To help promote well-being, something you must have heard about, is we've released an up-to-date research-based health and phys ed curriculum that provides children with the information they need in today's complex and ever-changing world. And I would like to thank People for Education, who has been one of our reliable supporters in saying that, yes, you really do need to get on with this. So as sort of just an aside, which is quite political, and they're not in my notes. I probably watched the federal election results with a slightly different slant than many other people, because I knew which ridings had people, well, not people, federal conservative candidates who were going door to door campaigning against the provincial sex ed curriculum, sort of like, oh, I'm so-and-so. Do you know what Justin Trudeau is going to do with sex ed? Which is inaccurate, seeing as the feds have absolutely nothing to do with elementary and secondary legislation, but was an interesting sort of foray into trying to create a wedge issue. And what I noted with great glee as the results unfolded was no Conservative won in any seat in which this was floated as a wedge issue. So I thought this was quite good. So aside from that issue, we've also ensured that every school board designate a mental health leader to help our strategy to improve awareness and supports for mental health. And we continue to work with many partners to create health, safe, and accepting learning environments, including the release of a revised Foundations for a Healthy School resource, which will help schools in board-level planning in terms of implementation. To enhance public confidence, we recently launched Experience Ontario, a new pilot program to help students make the transition between secondary and post-secondary education and training. Some of you may be involved with the programs, so we've now funded more than 2,200 projects during the 2015-16 school year through Parent Reaching Out grants to increase parent engagement in their children's learning. And I think this probably one of the provincial programs is some of the funding for this conference. The new and enhanced initial teacher education program came into effect this September as well, and that has had the effect of doubling the length of the initial teacher education program and also doubling the time for practice teaching. It also includes new mandatory core content at each faculty of education that highlights the Ontario curriculum and important areas such as math pedagogy. It also includes financial literacy, Aboriginal perspectives in history, and environmental education. So all of those things must be included in initial teach. Oh, another one I also get letters about is special education must now be included in the initial teacher education of each and every teacher in Ontario. I bet you didn't realize it wasn't. It wasn't. Now it is. We have also established a $750 million school consolidation capital program to provide funding to boards to build new consolidated schools, additions, and undertake major renovations. And under this program, the first round of funding of more than $150 million was announced in 2015 and involved the building of 7 new schools, 11 additions, and 13 school renovation projects. We remain committed to implementing the Community Hub strategic framework with which Karen Petrie was working on, and that includes strategies for making school space more available and affordable for community users, and that's going to mean certainly a lot of work with some of our ministries who are our partners in that Community Hub project. Just a few things about the Aboriginal education, because I think you were talking to Carolyn Bennett a little bit earlier, so to let you know what we're doing there. And I know that that's an area that People for Education has been interested in. So our Aboriginal education strategy really has 2 strands. One is improving student achievement and well-being among First Nation, Métis, and Inuit students, and the other is closing the gap between the FNMI students and other students. So it isn't enough just to have everybody moving up together. What we want is to close the gap. So both of those things. One of the ways in which this is structured is that I actually have a First Nations advisory committee. It has a working group. We've worked on a number of strategies together, but we've actually had already revamped the Ontario curriculum, the social science history curriculum, to include a lot more information about Aboriginal perspectives and history and culture in Ontario, and in particular residential schools. Now with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we're going through that curriculum again to make sure that it's actually mandatory, because in some of the cases where it's in the curriculum, you could use the Aboriginal First Nations perspective as a sort of an either-or with some other example. So we're actually going through and making sure that it's mandatory that all Ontario students, Aboriginal or not, will learn about that. So there's some really exciting things. I can expand on that a little bit more if you want me to. So just once again to say thank you to all of you. Thank you for your partnership. And we can all now, I hope, get back to working on making a better education system in Ontario for all of our students working together. And Annie's going to share.
So we have time for a few questions if people want to take the microphone there. Please don't make big, long speeches. Please ask actual questions of the Minister. Thank you very much.
Oh, she just wants her seat back.
Yeah, I thought so too.
You're number 1.
Hi.
You thought you were number 2.
So my name is Chris Penrose. I'm with an organization called Success Beyond Limits. We partner with the TDSB, New York University, among other organizations. We run a youth space inside of a school, inside of Westview Centennial, and we work with youth at the high school age. The 2 questions I have, one is, we do see increasing graduation rates, across the board, but there's demographics that are stagnating, there are demographics that are falling back, and then there's a really difficult core inside that achievement gap to reach. For example, the provincial advocate shared information of the average age of the student in the Roy McMurtry facility is 17 with 2 credits. So I wonder in terms of what kind of efforts we can be doubling down on around really closing the achievement gap and opportunity gap, not just on that outside of easier to reach young people, but what kind of efforts we're doing to get at the hardest to reach. And the second question is regarding to youth space in schools. So one of the conversations from the youth panel was that just because youth are in a space doesn't make it a youth space. St. Stephen's House has done great research that the City of Toronto adopted around youth lounges. They're being expanded into community centers. Is there an appetite for expanding youth spaces into schools?
Okay, so you've asked a whole bunch of questions there.
Well, it's 2.
So,
are we really going to get serious
yeah.
about the hardest to reach youth and the achievement gap, and can we get youth spaces in schools?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that there are some groups of students that we really need to focus on that narrow group and also on those individuals. And you are right that failure to achieve a full slate of credits in grade 9 is a huge predictor of failing to graduate, which is what you were finding at McMurtry. So we actually know a lot about the characteristics that you can identify the kids back about grade 6 or grade 8 or grade 9 who are really in danger of failing. And that's where we need to continue to focus. So I agree with you. We need to continue to do that. The other thing that you're talking about is spaces that are more community space than education space. And it's that the reason I said that's different questions is because if you're talking about community space that people can use after hours, then it's really about community use of schools.
No, so I'm referring to youth space like community center, the youth lounge model inside of schools, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., spaces that are run by community partners inside of schools.
Yeah, and that's we're actually encouraging that sort of thing, but that means that so there's no reason, like there's this perception that if there's a child care or a community youth space, what you're calling a youth space, that somehow that isn't counted. We actually tell boards that if you've got a dedicated youth space or a child care space, it's supposed to come out of the inventory of school space that's available for elementary or secondary use. The issue isn't whether the space can come out of the inventory. The real issue is somebody able to pay the rent on that space. When it's a child care, the child care operator pays the rent on the space. What it becomes difficult with other forms of community hubs is how does that space get paid for? It's easy to take it out of the inventory of space. The difficult decision is who else is then going to pay for the space?
Next question, as short as possible.
Yes. Can you tell us when the Barbara Hall report on the TDSB will be made public?
Good, clear question.
I'm going to be very honest with you. It did not seem productive to be releasing the report when everybody was talking about collective bargaining. So now that is calming down a bit, we can look at that. It just did not seem productive to be discussing a very serious issue in the context of some other very serious issues.
But it will be made.
Oh, absolutely. No. Trust me, it will be made public. It was just we didn't want it to get buried under the flap over umpteen things that had nothing to do with it.
Thank you, Minister, for taking my question. I know Premier Wynne has for a long time been a strong advocate of child poverty reduction. Mm-hmm. And my question is to do with, I'm just wondering if we have any data exploring relationships between children from lower SES situations and their performance on standardized testing, particularly maybe more so in the math piece.
It is generally true everywhere in the world that there's a significant socioeconomic influence on performance results. If you look at Canada and Ontario in particular, the gap, socioeconomic-based gap that is related is narrow. So if I can do it this way, pictorially, in most countries of the world, the line looks like this: achievement based on socioeconomic status. In Ontario, it's much flatter. So that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is what you've just observed, is that socioeconomic status has a high impact on outcomes. So absolutely, we need to keep working on we need to keep working on poverty in and of itself, but we also need to keep working on outcomes of those who are particularly challenged. And that's why, that's why we actually have an equity piece in our vision, and we've said right now we have to look at Aboriginal, which of course is also a socioeconomic gap issue, not just an Aboriginal issue per se. The kids who are kids in care, but all the groups that we've described are groups where we need to work on closing the gap. And certainly when we look at the funding that goes to urban schools at risk, that's a socioeconomic evaluation of those communities, that they attract special funding over, above and beyond. Have we solved the problem totally? Absolutely not. Do we need to keep working on it? Totally, yes.
Thank you.
Very last question here.
Hello, I'm a parent of a now 27-year-old daughter, and we live directly across from what used to be a public school, now flatland that's going to become 124 units. Now the question is, with the demolishment of schools, and then 124, a mile and a half north of me, there's going to be 4 huge high-rises. Where are you going to put the kids? And again, it sounds like provincial funding, and then it's back to the TDSB. In other words, can we stop all these stoppings of schools, because you don't also know how many kids you're going to need in a given area down the street. And the way growth is going all the way around me, I think closing of the school is counterproductive.
That's, okay, a couple of comments quickly there. That's number one, why we are saying all over the province, not just in Toronto, all over the province, that boards and municipalities need to sit down together and share planning data. But the other thing is, the reality is that no, it isn't a money issue. It's that the reality is there are less children being born today than there were a generation ago. So that the number of schools that are required to service a particular number of houses or units is actually less, because there are way less kids per unit than there were a generation ago. And so yes, there's a planning issue here. Yes, population shift, but you actually have way less kids per unit than you have to. So we have to figure this one out.
4 high-rises, what have you.
Thank you very, very much, Minister, for coming and sharing this with us, and I'm sure we'll keep on having questions and we'll keep on asking them. So can we thank the Minister, please?